Hello everyone, we are back and we would like to open the session Harnessing the Power of Data. The first speaker in the session is Dr. Dean Morbeck. Dean is the Scientific Director at the Fertility Associate New Zealand, Sanford International Fertility Centre and an honorary lecturer at the University of Auckland. He oversees science in IVF clinics throughout New Zealand and Malaysia that annually perform more than 4,000 fresh cycles. Prior to moving to New Zealand, Dean was an associate professor at the Mayo Clinic. He has a keen interest in quality of care, as evidenced by his publications on media composition and laboratory key performance indicators. He has also completed an MBA, which he is putting to use to improve both the science and patient experience at Fertility Associate and Sanford. He will discuss today the topic, the importance of using electronic patients record for IVF units, improving patients' care through accurate analysis of data. So Dean, please go ahead. Stage is yours.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to share with the conference delegates our experience in New Zealand and Malaysia using an EMR to track performance, do research, and assure quality. Our clinics in New Zealand started using MediTEX shortly after my move from the Mayo Clinic in 2016, and we installed the system in our 4 clinics in Malaysia over a year ago. Having a common EMR across all of our clinics in 2 countries has proven useful. Here are my disclosures. I am a shareholder in Fertility Associates, which performs 70% of the IVF in New Zealand, and with our Malaysian headquarters clinic, Sanford in Kuala Lumpur. Sanford has multiple locations and is one of the largest fertility companies in Malaysia. None of the advisory board activities are conflicts. I am a MediTEX customer and active user. I have a bias when it comes to databases. I'm partial to having a relational database that's easy to query. From the first clinic I opened in Ohio in 1995, I've always had a database for tracking laboratory performance, mostly through something like Microsoft Access. So ease of query generation is a big deal to me, and having end user customization of queries is also essential. So I have 3 objectives today. We'll start, the first one is to discuss routine KPI tracking, which we do several times a month here in New Zealand and Malaysia. While we track many KPIs, and I could discuss in detail our experience, I'll focus on what we consider our most timely and sensitive measure of clinic and laboratory performance, that is day 5 embryo use rate. The second objective is to describe quality assurance of clinical practice changes. All clinics make substantial changes from time to time, and even what might be considered low-risk changes in practice could have unintended consequences. For this example, I'll present our review of live birth rates following a change of frozen embryo transfer day from the 5th to the 6th day of progesterone. The final objective illustrates how an EMR is useful for validating practice changes prospectively. In this example, we performed a validation of 2 culture media and used the outcome of first transfer after retrieval with an eye on birth weight analysis as well. KPI tracking. Before diving into details of how we analyze KPI performance, I'd like to first acknowledge the Mortimers, Sharon and David, for their consistent work promoting the use of control charts for tracking performance of IVF laboratories. They have spoken and written about control charts for ART, and we believe our paper shown here is the first example of control charts in action for tracking shifts in quality. The reason I highlight this and this journey we've been on is because robust data that is easily obtained and analyzed is essential to perform meaningful KPI control chart tracking. I'd like to emphasize that in New Zealand, we use MediTEX to track performance for over 2,500 OPUs per year across 5 clinics. The Mortimers have been telling us we need to do this, and while I've been tracking outcomes in my clinics for decades, I was not able to provide an example of effectiveness as we did in this paper. And I know many others who do so as well using different systems. but I've yet to find one that is working like the one we have here. Okay, so to dive into this paper, let's share a little of the results from that paper in Human Reproduction. This slide shows that we tracked KPIs over 3 5-month periods, with the middle period being an intentional change in culture conditions, a really commonly introduced new culture media. This study is retrospective in nature, and I'll share why shortly. Critically, it's important to note that while we had a planned change in conditions, unplanned and unexpected changes do occur, which is why we monitor KPIs as early warning signals if something isn't working as it should be, well before we detect the change with clinical pregnancy rates. As I mentioned at the start, there are many laboratory KPIs, with several listed here. These last two, our implantation and ongoing pregnancy rate, are obviously more than just the laboratory, but we all know the laboratory plays a critical role, and thus we also include these for our analysis. But the first 4 KPIs provide meaningful information. And I'd like to point out that we only started tracking this day 5 embryo use rate after the Vienna Consensus on KPIs was published in 2017. Prior to this, we used total embryo use rate. And as long as we had about 50% of all 2PN zygotes making usable blastocysts, we were hitting our target. However, as we learned, day 5 usable blastocyst rate factors in speed of development, and we found that this is an important barometer of culture conditions. Okay, this slide shows the benefits of day 5 usable blast rate as published in our 2019 paper. What I don't show is that total embryo use rate stayed constant during this 15 months shown. As you can see, we saw an immediate drop in day 5 use rate in November when we switched to the new culture medium. And I'd like to point out one more thing that's critical in this graph. This X marks the point where we were able to detect a shift in pregnancy rates with control chart tracking for pregnancy rates. And it's what prompted us to look further into the embryo growth data. Had we been tracking day 5 usable blast rates back here, we would have noted this shift much earlier. These results illustrate the power of handy, accurate, and comprehensive data. Next, I'd like to illustrate how we perform data analysis using MediTEX. I think it's really helpful for everyone to be able to see that it can be effortless to get data out of your system. And it's not always straightforward, and I've worked with different systems in the past. While some IVF clinics only use the laboratory model of EMR, we use MediTEX in New Zealand for the entire patient journey, which allows us to do multivariate analysis of outcomes, which is critical. So that means it contains medical and treatment history of all patients. It's basically a digital version of the paper file. And it allows us to use this thing called the query designer to run queries to get our data for statistics. So I'm just going to walk you through what this looks like, because I do think it's helpful to know that this is something that is should be easy for everyone, regardless of what system you're using. So here are tables. These are actually folders over here of different types of tables. So patients would be demographics, cycles would be the actual types of cycles present, outcomes and cryopreservation database, all really important things. So what we would typically do is open up a table here, drag it to this middle section, and then select the query from there. So I'll just show you one of these. So when I build queries, I save them in my own folder. So I've got a folder here, ADMO, for easy repeated use. So here's a whole bunch of different queries that I've got named. Every user has a folder for their own queries, so managers can run queries for their staff as well, so it comes in quite handy. This pop-up window shows a list of queries, and the one selected is ICSI fertilization. You can see that, and that's the one I use to track both clinic-wide and embryologist-specific fertilization rates. Now on this slide, you can see examples of tables here on the left, and I can easily access medication, ultrasound, and pregnancy data for each cycle. In the middle is where I've nested 5 separate tables. So all I've done is dragged 5 tables over to here to get the fields that I have of interest. This is the final tables fields here. This ART treatments showing that what treatment did we perform. So the treatment would be either IVF or ICSI, and who performed the treatment. So this allows me to easily get this data out. So what does this look like? Well, this is a lot of data, a lot of small print. I don't expect you to read this, but you may wonder, how do we get these results out? Well, before we even get the results out, we can just click on little drop-down tabs, just like in Excel when you have the filter function on the top row, which allows us to select for different clinics, for different embryologists, for different doctors, whatever it is that you have in this, you can do selections on. But there's also the ability to export these. So usually we export these to Excel or CVS, or as a CVS file for further analysis. As you can see at the top of the screen, there's an export tab, and it gives several file type options. So this makes analysis with other programs very easy. All right, now I'd like to shift gears and talk about quality assurance following practice changes. For various reasons, the field of ART does not have a complete consensus on the optimal duration of progesterone prior to embryo transfer in programmed HRT, frozen embryo transfer cycles. While much of the world has transitioned to the 6th day or following 5 days of progesterone, the evidence for which day is optimal is quite limited. So when I arrived in New Zealand, we were transferring on the 5th day. And after review, we planned and we did change to the 6th day at the beginning of 2019. Part of quality assurance is assessing how things went. We have since studied the results of this change to determine if it mattered. And this is important. It might not make a difference, or possibly it could yield worse results. We don't know, so we have to check. And EMR provides all the data one needs to comprehensively assess the effects of this change in practice. And I'd like to emphasize, this is not a simple analysis without an EMR. So first, I'd like to describe the features of a robust retrospective analysis. Well-controlled means that we have control over who got which treatment and when, and that is readily apparent in our data set. So control in this sense may not be the RCT control, but for us, well-controlled, that we can really tell what we have, and we have good evidence for that. The cleanest analysis also includes only SET cycles, so single embryo transfers, and live birth rate per cycle. Or in this case, since it's a study of FET programming, it's per transfer analysis. We usually start with a univariate analysis, comparing live birth rate for 2 time periods or 2 treatments. Of course, we all know that age is the single largest factor associated with live birth rate, so we have to account for this. And we do it with a multivariate analysis that includes as many modifiers as possible to account for model variation. This graph shows that we saw a trending increase in live birth rate in our 6th day of progesterone group. At p equals 0.11, you might say, good enough, there's an increase, and with more cycles, it would likely be statistically significant. However, what if the first group had more older patients so that the average age was greater? Or perhaps they had poor quality blastocysts transferred. If we don't account for these modifiers, we can't know with certainty that a change has the intended effect. So that brings us to multivariate analysis. Now, this is an image from the statistics software we use, JMP from SAS. And what happens is our EMR provides easy access to the modifiers you see here that allows us to perform this multivariate analysis. So these are some of the various variables that accounted for differences in live birth rate. Age, as expected, was quite large, and day 5 versus day 6 embryos was also quite significant and the second largest. Unlike in the univariate analysis, where the p-value was 0.11, which is the 5th versus 6th day, it's significant here at 0.013. The odds ratio for day of progesterone is significant at 1.4. In addition, we found an interaction between the age versus day of progesterone. So when we performed a sub-analysis, we found the impact of the different days of progesterone was particularly pronounced in younger patients, those under 38, shown here. These results illustrate the power of a complete data set that is readily accessible, and there's no more manual chart reviews. So the third example I'll share is a prospective validation of a change in culture medium. As shown in the first example with KPI tracking, we learned that we must carefully assess major practice changes like moving to a new culture medium. We chose to compare CSC from Irvine Scientific, a single-step culture medium, with a relatively new version of that same media that the only difference is that it contains low concentrations of lactate, and it's called CSC-NX. So to do this, we allocated patients to one of two media over a set period of time, with a target of 700 patients to have enough power to adequately assess performance. This was our validation of this additional change to this culture media. So the next question is, which endpoints do we think would matter? Well, of course, we continue to use day 5 use rate as a primary outcome, along with total use rate. We'll continue to follow that as well. But now we extend this to also include the primary outcome clinical pregnancy rate. And that's defined as that following the first embryo transfer, whether it's fresh or frozen. Now, I also list here neonatal outcomes, which of course will take much longer to obtain, along with live birth rate. We feel confident that if we have good blastocyst development and clinical pregnancy rates, so these first few, then we can make the change to this new culture media, and that's the goal of this validation. So here are the results. We did not observe a difference in day 5 use rate, but did obtain more usable blastocysts with CSC-NX in the older patient group. Now, we have not yet seen a difference in clinical pregnancy rates, and we believe the small change in composition likely won't have an effect on a per transfer basis. One possibility, however, is that we'll have a higher cumulative live birth rate per OPU for older patients, since we obtain more blastocysts for this group. Lastly, and very importantly, we'll be able to assess whether a change in lactate concentration impacts birth weight, to address the theory that culture medium may have epigenetic effects that affect neonatal outcomes. Again, this is not something that is easy to do without an electronic medical record. So there's more of this to follow, and watch this space. So let me bring this all together. The last study raised an important point, that we must continue to adjust our KPI thresholds as we make changes and see improvements. This graph shows our day 5 blastocyst utilization rate, and let me bring it up a little closer. Here's the day 5 blastocyst utilization, or embryo use rate on day 5, and you can see for the past 4 months, 1, 2, 3, 4 months, the rate has shifted above the historic average. This happens to coincide with our complete changeover to using CSC-NX, which appears to have an effect on day 5 use rate that was not noted during the validation. And this shift indicates that we must reset our average day 5 rate for our control charts moving forward. So you can see we were set here at an average of 40% over the past year. And now if this trend continues, we will be changing that control chart to shift up to 40 to 45%. In case you're wondering, this graph is simply a conversion of the raw data from MediTEX using pivot tables in Excel. The tabs at the bottom show that we track numerous KPIs in this one Excel spreadsheet. It's really quite handy and doesn't take much effort. Once you have the couple of original data files that are downloaded from the EMR present here, then they will automatically populate the rest. All right, in summary, an EMR facilitates powerful analysis of KPIs to quickly identify shifts in clinical performance. Its retrospective quality assurance following practice changes requires multiple variate analysis that an EMR delivers seamlessly. And last, an EMR facilitates the calculation of unique measures, such as the primary outcome and live birth rate per OPU. An electronic medical record is, in my opinion, an essential tool in the administration of patient care, quality assurance, and research. I'd like to close with an acknowledgement of several people here in New Zealand. Elizabeth Hammond, Lily Hammond, is my associate who is the pivot table wizard. She does a lot of the analysis of our KPIs, and as you can see, she also has authored some of our papers. John Peake is really the father of clinical embryology in New Zealand. He is my mentor here and a trusted and true friend. Lucas Fernandez is our main contact at MediTEX and has been there through a lot over the past 4 years, almost 5 years now, of developing queries and optimizing the system. And lastly, the patients and staff at Fertility Associates and at Sunford International Fertility Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for an excellent talk. Several questions, quite a lot. May I ask you for a very short answer?
Yes.
Have you tried to optimize gonadotropin treatment based on analyzing the results you generated with this program?
That's a great question. Yes. So one of the areas that we found is often we'll potentially have an understimulation on patients. So we're using what I've termed as a poor stim outcome in a good prognosis patient, and that we use that to change our stimulation dosage going forward. So we have used it for that purpose, yeah.
Have you seen any changes between different gonadotropins available in the market?
We haven't done any analysis on the different sources.
Have you done any analysis on luteal support using different progesterone, different drugs?
So we've not, at this point, we're currently analyzing Dufastin added in. So that's something that we're able to track as well. You know, the entire cycle is trackable here with the system, and we have been following some luteal support, mostly in programmed frozen embryo transfer cycles.
By the way, how do you analyze the results with the Dufaston? Do you do it in fresh cycle, in frozen cycle?
It's just frozen. So right now we're looking to just add it in frozens. We think it's appealing for fresh, but it's not something that we, believe it or not, can get readily in New Zealand. We don't have a distributor here, so it's quite challenging to get it into the country.
Right. Who is entering the data into the system? Is it your team, or do you have a special secretary? Because there are lots of data that you add to the program.
Yeah, that's a great question. So doctors obviously enter some of the demographic data when they're sitting with the patient. That's an easy time to do it. Administrators will put in some of that demographic up front when they make the patient's record. And of course, both nurses and the embryologists would enter a bulk of the material for the IVF cycles, of course. So it's mostly embryologists that enter the cycle-specific egg and embryo data.
Is the system able to collect data from time-lapse, adjust to different brands?
So at this point, I'm aware that it is being linked with a couple different time-lapse systems. What we know is that, like most EMRs, they have the API interface that they can easily adapt and go between. So while we don't use that currently, it is something that we are looking towards, and we know is a simple functionality to add in.
In general, do you communicate with the patient through the system, and how do you secure patients' records, over the internet?
Yes. So we do have the ability to send emails and text to the patient through the system. And I know there's different opinions about security of, say, texting, but the actual system is, of course, housed just in our servers, so the security there. It's any kind of communication online with patients that there's some risk, but it's specifically targeted at their emails or their phone. And then we've also been adding on another third-party software called Salve, which allows us to have a better patient interface for adding in some more, patient-centered care.
The last one is a personal one. When you present one of the charge, I saw that it's written there IMSI. Are you using IMSI?
Yeah, we're no longer using IMSI. We had IMSI when I got here, and I analyzed it and didn't find that it had a benefit, so we stopped using IMSI.
Okay. Dean, thank you very much for being with us from Auckland.
Yes.
Time difference is quite huge, quite a lot. And again, it was an excellent talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Zeev. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
All right.